Hey folks, how are you? Yay. Right, so I'm here to talk about schema-driven observability. I know it's not AI, so it might not seem interesting. It might be, yeah, uh, but something that I feel like a lot of us do not give a lot of attention to, but like at the same time, like very, very important for us, right? How many of you are like software engineers here, like write code or anything like that? A lot of you, right? So I feel like the biggest problem I think in software engineering is naming things in general. Like naming things is like not easy. It can be like you name it well, you do it well, then it's easy to maintain. You share it with teams, everyone can understand what it is for. But if you name it wrong, like it just creates a lot of confusion. Is not really great for anything, right? So naming is in difficult, but again, like very, very important in general, right? But at the same time, like have you thought about like why do we have logs, like metrics, traces, span attributes? Like have you ever thought like when we name those, like do we give like equal thought to that, right? And just sharing an example of an hotel metric here. I hope everyone is aware of hotel. If not, I'll share details about that as well later on. But I do, um so if you have seen an hotel metric, essentially like this is a name. This is the metric name. This is a sample. This just shows like my AI usage essentially, right? And then you also have like attributes. The good part about all of this is like this is flexible. I can name them anything. There's no like it can be XYZ at the end of the day, right? As long as at the end user can understand them, right? But with more flexibility, it makes it more complex at the end of the day, because some teams can use some different things, some teams can use something else. And just using this as an example, let's imagine like we have three AI teams in a same organization, right? And all of these teams use a different framework for doing observability, right? One used OpenLit, one used Open Inference, one used the all of the other like all of the three teams used different instrumentations at the end of the day, right? The problem is like these three instrumentations do not give out the same for like usage, for cost, tokens specifically. They don't have the same attribute name. Like one uses something else, one uses token, one has like an LLM in front. So it's not really standardized as such, right? So these three teams did this, which is not great. Now we have like a usage explosion, like our AI usage cost exploded. So now my task at the end of the day as an SRE is like, all right, which application did this come from? Like, right. So I check the first application, everything seems unique, like it's been standard, like nothing has exploded as such, right? It works. I go to the second application and I have, oops, nothing exists. So the first instant I have an SRE is like, is the application even running? Or like, is the label right? Like, what is wrong with this, right? It worked for the first application. What is wrong in the second application, right? So now during an incident, I'm spending more time towards figuring out if this is the right thing I'm searching for, or like what's wrong. Like, I don't want to be fixing my observability stack during an incident. I want to be resolving the incident, right? So everything in our tech stack essentially has a schema, right? If you look at it, like APIs have an open API spec, databases have their own schema. Like if you insert a data which is not according to the schema, the insert would fail, the update would fail, right? Even events nowadays have like a JSON schema attached to them. But observability still does not have like a schema defined. Like you can name it anything and it'll just go, right? And that's the problem I think all of us like keep repeating at the end of the day, right? If you rename like a metric or a label, the visualization would just not work because they are hard coded with specific label set, label keys. If you change them, the visualization would break, right? And let's say like in the first case which I showed, like even the token usage, if the label changes, right? The firstly the alert would fire like the application is not running because there's no data for that application, right? The second case would be like the actual alert that should have fired for the token usage being exploding, right? That alert did not go off because someone changed the label at the end of the day, right? And as we saw, There were three AI frameworks, AI observability frameworks, and they all use different span attributes for the same thing. No standardization again at this point. Now, if I can't really search for what's wrong with my application, then why are we even observing applications at the end of the day, right? It's just waste of everything, to be honest, resources. And that's where hotel really blends in very, very well. I hope everyone's like, I don't know how many of you were there, like with the CSCF group here, but hotel is like the second fastest CNCF, and it graduated, I think, this week itself or like last week. And it's essentially the de facto standard for observability. As I like to say it, like it is the USB-C for observability. It plugs into any vendor that you can think of, any observability tool. So much like a USB-C is what I would say. Right now, that all is like a hotel is like a standard. It's like a feeling, I would say. Like, what's the actual role of hotel in the schema-driven observability? I'm trying to say, right? So hotel is essentially a group of people who decided, all right, we need standardization. All right, if we have a metric for HTTP request duration, let's say, right, what is the standard meaning of that? Like, what do we mean when we say a duration? Like, what is the unit? How, like, it's a dictionary at the end of the day, right? We properly define, like, all right, these are the names, these are the attributes, this is how it should look like, right? And these are versioned as well, like, um, which makes everything very easy, I would say. And the next part is like a lot of people. It's not centrally owned or anything. Everyone can go there, contribute their ideas, opinions, or like make their changes and stuff like that, right? And it's also something that's growing very, very fast, I would say. In hotel, for almost every tech stack that you can think of, networking, Kubernetes, databases, services, GPUs, even, or like AI, all of them have their own namespaces. Like people are there who are defining, all right, this for an AI, this is how the token should look like, or like for a service, this is how the CPU label should look like, essentially, right? Or like a span attribute, let's say. Cool. Just to share, again, this might look a bit small, which I didn't account for very well. But this is an example of how the token, the metric looks like in the hotel defined schema itself. We have the metric name. We also define, like, all right, the metric, what is the instrumentation type? Is it a histogram? Is it a gauge? Like, what is it? Right. And the most important part, I think, one is like obviously unit. For example, when we talk about duration, some can, like, for example, let's say weight. In the US, they say lbs. In the standard units, we say something else, right? Like even speed in the US is miles. Here we have kmph, right? So what OTel is trying to do is like standardize them. Like a unit is fixed. So if it's a duration, it is seconds. It is not nanoseconds. It is not milliseconds. It's not an hour. It is seconds. So all of that we define. And the one interesting aspect that you would see is the stability level here. What by stability level means is like some obviously stable, that like HTTP request duration. These are like very, very standard. These have been there for like 15, a lot long time, right? But like these are the AI span attributes. These are relatively new, so they are still in dev phase. But the prescription, to be honest, is like align with the SEMCOV as much as you can. So yeah. This similar schema basically exists for like spans. Similar schema exists for like events, which are logs, essentially, as well. And again, using that as an example, like when we saw the first slide, we saw the third slide, we saw three different AI frameworks emitting the same attribute in different ways, right? The only framework that was emitting in the right way was OpenLit, and hence I would say, like, if you can align, or like not specifically saying OpenLit, if you use any tool, to be honest, try to also think of, all right, is the data compliant with the hotel schema that's already defined for this specific namespace, right? And treat like observability as a first class citizen and not like a second class citizen where, all right, you deploy something and then you're like, all right, I need observability for this as well. So what hotel does very, very well is like it has defined the schema for like industry standard things like services, as I said, or like infrastructure. But let's say if you want to create like a schema for like something specific, like books, let's say, right? You don't have schemas for that in the hotel world, right? So what you can do is like build your own schema, let's say. So I'm an engineer again. I create like a doc, share it with my team, where I name or it. I have a book label, a metric for book count specifically, and this is the name that I would name. And this is the description. This is the stability level. These are the attributes that should go in the metric itself. With the description, is it the value should be a string or an integer or like what? I create this doc, share it to the team. Now what? Um, it's just on a doc, right? How do we make sure, like, all right, we have the location attribute here, right? Some teams might be like, all right, we also need the zip code here, right? So do we change the attribute itself? Do these teams create their own attribute again? How does that work, right? Again, this is documentation at the end of the day, and we all know keeping documentation up to what exists in code does not align very well. It's the most toughest task I would say exists out there, right? And again, this doc exists, but who takes the ownership of this doc, and how do I make sure like the other teams adopt these schema in their data, right? I can't really fire them as such, like, all right, you have to adopt them or otherwise you're gone. It does not work like that, right? So don't really know like how do we, there's no incentive for the teams to adopt this, because this is like, again, this is not something that these teams think of as a first class thing. It's like something, or we create a feature and then we'll think about this observability thing at the end, right? That's where to help us, Hotel created a tool called Weaver. Has anyone of you heard about Weaver here? Oh nice, great. um, so talking about Weaver is essentially a toolkit for semantic or like schema essentially. Let's use the word schema itself. um, what it does great is like, all right, it can create instrumentation clients for you as well. Like if you give it a schema, it will create instrumentation clients that you can use in your that you can use to instrument your application itself. The second part is like it can validate your policies. All right, if one team has created like a specific attribute, book count, let's say, right, and if another team like violates that, like I can have a validation CI that would detect that and flag it like before it goes into prod, right? Uh, and let's say even if a metric goes into prod without the validation failing, let's say, like I can live check my data across observability tools, get the data, and then check the data if the live data is being aligning with the schema that we defined earlier, right? This is the Weaver architecture. This is from the Weaver docs itself. This looks a bit complex, bit big. To be honest, some parts are like owned by the Weaver tool itself. Some are owned by the devs. But I don't really want to spend time on discussing this. So let's bin this. Uh, I'll talk about a simpler Weaver architecture with my. So essentially, what it is like, you create like schema definitions for metrics, for spans, for attributes, right? You feed it into Weaver. Weaver would like create Ginger that you can use in your code base, right? Ginger can be used for like generating documentation or like code instrumentations. So anything that Ginger can be used for, essentially, right? So at its core, what Weaver is essentially like like or like a lot of teams use it in a CLI way or like a platform tool in CI, let's say, right? And it helps validates what we create, right? The span attributes, it follows a name. These attributes like exist all the time. These values are always aligned with what's defined in the schema. It can create code instrumentation, as I said, and it also enforces like it cannot you cannot violate rules that you create essentially, so right. So these three are like the main features, I would say, of Weaver. There are some other stuff that it can do, but smaller, not very important, I would say. I want to show like a quick demo of how Weaver works. Again, this is from the official hotel docs. uh, I would have to cool. So how we work with Weaver is essentially I create like an like in any language you create like an init file, right? What this file is, the manifest.yaml is basically an init file, right? Where I defined all that the schema name, the schema version, and what other schemas it depends on, right? Then the good part about Weaver also is like if I create like a schema, let's say like OTel already has like a schema defined for like HTTP, for gRPC, and etc. Right? If I want to reuse those registries, I can reuse them as well and extend them in my application. The second part is all right. I want to show like how my span should look like. All right, the span should be looking like this. These are the attributes it should have. These are the requirement levels. So per span, same for metrics as well. Like metrics exist. This is the unit for the metric. These are the attributes for the metric. Right. Once I have all of that, the first issue that all of us had was, let me see, the first issue that we had, all right, that's in a doc, and those docs, as we said, do not version well with what's in the application itself, right? So what we can do is like generate the documentation about a schema from what's defined in our application itself, right? Yeah. So they won't like version or be out of date at all at any time. So if I go to docs, which are just created right now, I go to, let's say, OTel SDK markdown, let's say. Again, I'm working on a very small screen, so I don't know how much of this would render. Yes. So essentially, I get like a doc that I can share to teams, or like teams can reference all right. These are the attributes that exist. These are the values, and these are the labels that should exist. Right. These are the span names. How everything should look. So the first issue is solved. Right. Now let's say I wanna also create. Now how do we align with it? All right. I create like a doc, but how do I make sure like these attributes are used in the application itself? So I can generate like templates in my code. Let's say for Rust here, and I would go to the src folder, go to generated. I would have the metrics that I can use. Like the name would be used from the registry that's centrally stored. So at the end of the day, at the end of the day, right? Um, so yeah, this solves like two things. Like everything is centrally stored: the metric name, the attributes, the span names, etc. And also the documentation is generated from the code itself. So versioning it out is like won't happen as much, right? Let's use the second example, which I want to show. Like if you have like live, is the mic on? When you have like live data flowing into the application, right? As I said, I don't have an observability tool here. I didn't want to do that. I have like a small sample metrics JSON, which shows I have two metrics flowing in, called example.name, and the value is like very different. One has a value which is like uppercase, one has a value which is like lowercase, literally called like lowercase id, right? Now I defined my schema about this metric, and which clearly says that the name identifier must be uppercase, right? But like one of them was in lowercase, right? So I defined a rule here which essentially says, all right, the label should be uppercase. It should be a string if a specific attribute is there. Like if the specific attribute says upper, then the label name should also be in uppercase, or depends on that, right? So when I run my input samples against the policy that I defined, I should ideally get like a violation which should say like why exactly my data like my CI failed, right? You have a live metric in your observability tool that does not align with the schema that you've defined, right? It should clearly say like lowercase id on attribute must be uppercase, right? So this solves like two cases. One, I have now rules that control like what attributes should look like, and the CI should fail on that. Like, and even if a metric goes into observability, like any tool, I can still detect that and ask the specific team, all right, why did you drift from the defined schema? And is there a reason? And if there is a reason, how do we get you back into the schema? Aligning with the schema is like very, very important again. All right. So we had 4 main things that to address, right? So cross-referencing, like how do each individual team use the same span attributes, same metric name, same labels, that can be addressed by having those Weaver schemas defined centrally in a central repo. The platform team can own that, right? That I just showcased. The second issue was like schema docs are like docs which don't which go out of date very well, like very soon, very quickly. So Weaver can help you solve that essentially, since Weaver is the one that's maintaining these docs, generating these docs, and all of this should live in your CI. Like as long whenever a main branch gets updated, a Weaver CI should start working and update those docs, right? Ownership process, again, as I said, like the entire schema should be centrally housed by the SRE team, platform team, and that houses that shares the main Git repository that houses the Weaver and the CI workflows, right? And how do we ensure teams adopt this? We can't ask them to adopt the entire schema, but we can ask them to adopt the instrumentation clients that the teams have created. It's just including that instrumentation client, and they should be uh, using the same schema that we defined centrally, right? Cool. This was like a 101 on schema-driven observability. I don't have anything else. Cool. Thank you, and